Well, congratulations, everybody. You have made it to week 7, and now we're going to discuss chapter 8, the sensory motor system. This is a very applied chapter. I know I've been telling you that for quite some time now, but what you discovered in chapter 3 and chapter 4 will definitely carry with you throughout all of the subsequent chapters. We went into a lot of detail about motor areas in the brain in chapter 3. We talked about basal ganglia. We talked about the sensory motor cortex, the motor cortex. And now in this chapter, we get to really focus in on the whole motor pathway from the muscles to the association cortices that organize and control all of those movements. Okay, so let's get started. It says 3 principles of sensory motor function. Okay, you have the hold on one second here. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so the 3 principles of sensory motor function. We talked about the hierarchical organization, but here we're going to talk about it a little bit more in detail. So you have the association cortex, or cortices, if there's multiple cortex, and this is going to be the highest level, okay? Whereas the muscles would be at the lowest level of the organization. They're also parallel to one another. So that means that association cortices can speak to one another. Primary, secondary cortices, they can talk to each other in a parallel fashion as well as the hierarchical. Okay? Motor output is guided by sensory input. So there's a fine dance, you could say, that's going on between the sensory motor cortex and the motor cortex. Okay, you can think about it in a way of you have to perceive pain if you stub your toe, and that's done in the somatosensory area of the brain, and then that has to tell the motor area of the brain to withdraw the foot away from that object. Okay, and then of course you have all the learning mechanisms and everything else in your brain that says, well, don't do that again because it really hurt. So you can see how that all plays together. Okay. Learning changes the nature and locus of sensory motor control. And there's a couple things in here that I want to elaborate on before we go on to the next slide. And that has to do with how the author breaks down the hierarchical organization as it were, or as it would be like a business. Okay. It mentions here that, like the others issued from the office of company president, the commands that emerge from the association cortex specify general goals rather than specific plans. So the association cortex is where the president's office is, okay, highest level. Neither the association cortex nor the company president routinely gets involved in the details. The main advantage of this hierarchical organization is that the higher levels of the hierarchy are left free to perform more complex functions. Okay, so the muscles are busy. They're busy doing things. The primary motor cortex is busy doing things. And so that allows the association cortex, or you could think of it as the president, to think of things that might be more mission-driven or vision-driven, okay? Because he's not dealing with all the details of the day-to-day. Also, it says many adjustments in motor output that occur in response to sensory feedback are controlled unconsciously by the lower levels of the sensory motor hierarchy without the involvement of the higher levels. In the same way, large companies run more efficiently if the clerks do not check with the company president each time they encounter a minor problem. All right. And also, it says, during the initial stages of motor learning, each individual response is performed under conscious control. Then, after much practice, individual responses become organized into continuous integrated sequences of action that flow smoothly and are adjusted by sensory feedback without conscious regulation. Okay, so that's going back to this point here, where conscious to automatic. When you have to learn to do something for the very first time, you ride a bike for the very first time, you're walking a tightrope for the very first time, all of your effort is put on that. You're very, very conscious that you don't want to fall over, you don't want to fall off. But after you do it multiple times over and over, it becomes automatic. Okay, and it's just like walking. Okay. And now here's the diagram here. The association cortex at the very top, and you can see how there's a bidirectional arrow between them, so that's that parallel function. But then you go from association cortex to secondary, from secondary to primary, primary to brainstem out to the muscles. And you have also from the muscles where they can relay information back up to the brainstem, which then goes to the primary, secondary, and association. Okay, so it's a nice circle, it's a nice feedback loop, you could say, that works hierarchically as well as in a parallel fashion. Okay. So let's start with the association cortex, or the highest level. You have the posterior parietal association cortex, and then you have the dorsolateral prefrontal association cortex. And each is composed of several different areas with different functions. Let's look at what those are. So the posterior parietal association cortex, okay, integrates information about body part location and external objects. Remember, it's an association cortex, so it associates things. So it's going to bring in visual information, auditory information, somatosensory information, okay? And it's also outputting information to the motor cortex, okay? And this specifically includes dorsolateral prefrontal association cortex, the secondary motor, and then the frontal eye field. So where are all of these parts? Well, let's take a look. In chapter 3, just so we can, get back to our basics here and get an idea of where we are in the brain. Okay, remember where the central fissure was. The central fissure divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay, there were two gyri on each side of the central fissure. There was the precentral gyrus, and then there was the postcentral gyrus. Okay, the precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe, and that is the motor cortex. The postcentral gyrus is in the parietal lobe, and that is the somatosensory cortex. Okay, so even though we're going to be focusing on other parts of the brain, that's where at least you have your basis for motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. Okay, so if we look at the diagram here, figure 8.2, you see the somatosensory cortex in the postcentral gyrus there. And then you have, they don't show you on this, but in front of that, or it would be anterior to the somatosensory cortex, would be the motor cortex, and that would be in the precentral gyrus. Okay, so if we look at this, pathways of the posterior parietal association cortex. Okay, so again, posterior, that's going to be in the back side of the brain. Parietal, which means it's in the parietal lobe. So you see the light green areas, that's posterior parietal association cortex. That makes sense? The green color that you have up towards the anterior area of the brain is the dorsolateral prefrontal, okay, because it's in the frontal lobe, prefrontal association cortex. So, and then you have all of these arrows going around here. So you have visual cortex, and visual information feeds into the posterior parietal. You have auditory information from the auditory cortex going in. You have somatosensory information going in, and then you have information coming out, which is going to areas of secondary motor cortex, dorsolateral prefrontal association cortex, and the frontal eye field. Okay, and that is that one arrow that leaves the greenish color in the posterior parietal region, and then it splits off 4 different ways in the frontal lobe. Okay. So damage to the posterior parietal cortex. Well, there's a couple different conditions that your author provides you with. One is apraxia. Apraxia is a disorder of voluntary movement. This is an interesting one because The people, if like day-to-day working, let's say they're a framer and they swing a hammer, they can do that all day long. But if you put a hammer in front of them and they were to pick up the hammer, they wouldn't know what to do with the hammer. They wouldn't know that they couldn't initiate the movement. Okay? So it says it's a problem only evident when instructed to perform an action. I know it seems very abstract in that way, but that's what we're looking at here. And then contralateral neglect is an inability to respond to stimuli on the contralateral side of the lesion, usually seen with large lesions on the right side. So remember, contralateral means that it crosses over. So right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The right side of the body is controlled by the left hemisphere. Okay. And so this is the inability to respond to stimuli on the other side. You have a large lesion in the right hemisphere, and so now you neglect the left side of your body. These are people that they have a hard time. They'll put an arm through one sleeve of the shirt, and then they won't put their arm through the other. It's that distinguished. Okay, they'll put a mirror up to their face and only paint the lipstick on half of their lips. Again, a very, very abstract kind of a condition. Seems very strange that something like that would occur, but it can with cortical damage. Okay, what about the dorsolateral prefrontal association cortex? Okay, so the last one we talked about was the posterior parietal, and now we're looking at the dorsolateral prefrontal. Okay. Now both of these were shown on the diagram I just gave you, so we kind of went over both of them, but I'm going to do it again. Okay. So you have here input from the posterior parietal cortex. Also you have output to secondary cortex, primary cortex, and the frontal eye field. And the dorsolateral prefrontal association cortex evaluates external stimuli and initiates voluntary reactions. Okay. So evaluates external stimuli and initiates voluntary reactions. You can think about this in regard to anytime you have the frontal lobe, pretty much anytime you have the frontal lobe involved in something, it's more of a complex issue. It's more of critical thinking or abstract thinking, because we know that those centers are in the frontal lobe. Okay, so like with this one here, evaluates the external stimuli. Okay, evaluates the external stimuli. So that's a good way of thinking. Well, the cortex that evaluates the external stimuli is going to be prefrontal. So it's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Let's look at this one. Okay, so now we're looking at the greenish area in the frontal lobe. Okay, and you can see where there's arrows that are moving over to some of the secondary cortex, the frontal eye field that you see there, and also areas of secondary motor cortex. Okay. Yeah. And remember, again, they're association cortices, and they can work in parallel. So that's why you have that big long arrow, that black arrow from the posterior parietal cortex all the way over to the dorsolateral prefrontal, because there's connections. Okay? There's always information that is flowing both ways from those. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the association cortices, what they're for, where they're located. Now let's move down one. Remember we were in the president's office with the association cortex. Now we're moving down one. Let's say secondary motor cortex. Let's say this is the vice president. Okay, and the input is mainly from the association, right? The vice president takes direction from the president. And then the output is mainly to the primary motor cortex. You can think of the primary motor cortex as like regional directors. Okay, those are all the directors that are under the vice president. There are at least 8 different areas, 3 supplemental motor areas, SMA stands for the supplemental, or it's an acronym for supplemental motor areas. 2 premotor areas, and then 3 cingulate motor areas. Okay. And I'll show you all of these on this diagram here. Okay. So here's where you have the cingulate motor areas, the supplementary motor area, primary motor cortex, premotor cortex. Okay. So everything still stems from that primary motor cortex in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Okay, if now you're talking about a gyrus that's anterior to that, now you're looking premotor cortex. Okay, and then remember you have the prefrontal association cortex because that's also in the frontal lobe. So that's making sense. The supplemental motor areas are also very close, right around the motor cortex. And then the cingulate motor cortex, they're going to be inferior to the motor cortex, right? Because they're below it. Okay. The secondary motor cortex may be involved in programming movements in response to input from the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So active during imagining or planning of movements. All right. So this area is active during imagining or planning of movements. And something really cool about the secondary motor cortex are these mirror neurons. Now, the mirror neurons have not been found in humans, but they've done lots of research in primates. Okay, and mirror neurons are active when performing an action or watching another perform the same action. And I'm going to want to guide you to figure 8.5, which is on page 195. Okay. Oh, it's actually the next slide over. So let's just go to that slide. It's better to describe it that way. Okay. So top left, you see a mirror neuron in the premotor cortex of a monkey fires when the monkey picks up the ball. Okay. And so that little line there on top of the triangle where it just says pick up, that's a neuron that's firing, okay, in the premotor cortex. Now, just to the right, the same mirror neuron fires when the experimenter picks up the ball. Think about that. Okay? So it's somebody observing. You observe an action, an observable behavior of some sort, and the brain reacts in the same way as if you were doing it yourself. Okay? Bottom left, the same mirror neuron does not fire when the monkey picks up an object other than the ball. And then finally, the same mirror neuron does not fire when the experimenter picks up an object other than the ball. Okay? All right. Very cool stuff there. Okay, so when we talked about motor cortex, even in the previous chapter, in chapter 7, we talked a little bit about it and the homunculus and stuff. Basically, all we were talking about is the primary motor cortex. We didn't go into a lot of detail about the association cortex or the secondary motor cortex. So you know a little bit more already about the primary motor cortex. It is in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Okay, major point of convergence of cortical sensory motor signals, which means that, just like I was saying, that pain reception comes up to the somatosensory cortex, and then it's sent over to the motor cortex to move your foot away from that source of pain. Major point of departure of signals from the cortex. Okay, conventional view of primary motor cortex is somatotopic. Okay, more cortex is devoted to body parts that make complex movements. And we have, again, the motor homunculus. And here's a diagram of that, figure 8.6. And you just notice how, again, it shows you where it is, central fissure, pre and post gyri there. So you know where it is in the brain. And then when it's expanded, you can see that the face is a very, very large portion, okay, of the somatosensory cortex and motor cortex, and so is the hand. Okay? So there's far more neurons that are specific to our hands and our face than anywhere else in the body. And that makes it very handy for us, right? It says, what is the function of each primary motor cortex neuron? Until recently, each neuron was thought to encode the direction of movement. The main evidence for this was the finding that each neuron in the arm area of the primary motor cortex fires maximally when the arm reaches any particular direction, and that each neuron has a different preferred direction. So that is a very complex process. Regions of primary motor cortex support initiation of species-typical movements, just like what I read there. Okay, what about lesioning or damage in this area? Well, small lesions often have minimal effects. And this is true, we've already mentioned it a couple times in previous chapters. When there's many connections, okay, when there's many pathways in and out of a cortex or something like that, small damage, small lesions don't have a lot of effect. Okay, does that make sense? But large lesions can still have detrimental effects, like the inability to move a body part independently of the others, or something that they call stereoagnosia, right? Which is the ability to identify an object by touch. Okay, the inability to identify an object by touch, and that would be because of a large lesion in this primary motor cortex. Okay, a couple other areas that we want to break out to. Don't know how we would mention these. I guess you could call these like regional directors also. So you have the president, you have the vice president. The vice president's giving their orders to all the different directors. So the cerebellum and the basal ganglia would be more individuals like that. Okay, they interact with different levels of the sensory motor hierarchy. They coordinate things, they modulate things, and they may permit maintenance of visually guided responses despite of cortical damage. Okay, so they may permit maintenance of visually guided responses. So you do have a large lesion in the primary motor cortex. Okay. Some of your ability to still function, like in this manner, visually guided responses can still function because of the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. Okay. Let's hit the cerebellum in a little bit more detail first. So the cerebellum has 10% of brain mass. We saw this in chapter 3. Okay, it's the you have the cortex, and the cerebellum looks much like the cortex, but it's much smaller. It's at the most posterior area of the brain. It's kind of underneath, ventral to the cortex as well. Okay, but it looks a lot like a cortex, and some of the reason for that is because more than 50%, okay, of the entire brain, or more than 50% of all the neurons in the entire brain are in the cerebellum. I was trying to read that and look at it at the same time, didn't come out. Okay, so 50% of all the neurons in the entire brain are located in the cerebellum. So this is fascinating to neuroscientists. They're just at the tip of really understanding. They're thinking that the cerebellum will probably end up telling us that it serves a lot more functions than what we realize at this time. But we just have to keep exploring. Okay? Input from primary and secondary motor cortex, input from the brainstem, feedback from motor responses. It's involved in timing, fine-tuning, and motor learning. It may also do the same for cognitive responses. All right, but you see a lot of those things are may do this, involved in this. Okay, because it's not really understood very much. The one thing that I kind of like in the cerebellum too is this motor learning process, kind of based on the fine tuning. What they believe is that, let's say somebody who plays a violin or something like that, and this goes back to that other issue also where you're learning to play the violin for the first time. It takes all of your conscious energy. It takes everything you have to focus on the right notes and moving your fingers and so on. But after a while, it becomes effortless. Okay. After a while, returning a serve that somebody serves a tennis ball at you and it's going over 100 miles an hour, and you return that tennis ball. Okay. There was no time for all of the motor cortex and sending messages to here and to the basal ganglia and coming back and then going out to a spindle fiber in your muscles and an extender. I mean, all of that going on. It happens all within a second in order for you to return that ball that's coming at you at 100 miles per hour. Same with hitting a baseball or something like that, right? So they believe that a lot of that function is handled by the cerebellum. Okay. Just give you a little idea. All right, the basal ganglia, that would be the other kind of regional director that we were talking about, right? It is a heterogeneous collection of interconnected nuclei. Remember, a bunch of nuclei are just a bunch of neurons in the central nervous system. So they might have various functions, and they all kind of come together in this one area. It's like a meeting place, kind of like a thalamus, right, for the motor system. Part of neural loops that receive cortical input and send output back via the thalamus, and then modulate motor output and cognitive functions, including learning. Okay, so that's the basal ganglia. All right, so we went association cortex to the primary motor cortex. Oh, sorry. No, association cortex. Then we went to secondary, and then we went to primary. Okay, and now we're going to descend the motor pathways from the central nervous system into the peripheral nervous system through first the brainstem and then the spinal cord. Okay, so descending motor pathways, there's 2 dorsolateral and there are 2 ventromedial. Okay, so let's look at these before we. The dorsolateral tracts. Most dorsolateral tracts synapse on interneurons of spinal gray matter. Okay, you have the corticospinal, which these control have control of the wrist, hands, fingers, and toes. I really tried to be careful reviewing this information for you, leaving out some of the things that I didn't think were necessary so that you could really focus on the most important part of this. So I didn't go into a lot of detail about the corticospinal or corticoruberospinal because I want you to basically know it's a dorsolateral tract. It's taking that information from that secondary motor cortex, okay, into the brainstem, into the spinal cord to affect muscles, right? So the corticospinal is going to affect muscles for the wrist, hands, fingers, toes. That's what's most important. Now I did leave for the second term there, synapse at red nucleus, and I left that there on purpose because rubro means red, and so that's why it's a corticoruberospinal dorsolateral tract. All right. So when you see that, you just say, oh, the corticoruberospinal, that passes through red nucleus. Okay? The corticospinal does not pass through red nucleus. So what does it do? Controls muscles of the face and then also distal muscles of arms and legs. And here it gives you an example. These are both dorsolateral. The one on the left is the corticospinal. The one on the right is the corticoruberospinal. Okay, and so you'll see the one on the right, it passes through red nucleus. The one on the left doesn't. I left out the other terms here and there. The other thing that you'll want to focus on right now, before we go to the ventromedial, is that And a lot of the tracks are this way. We're gonna talk about the mesolimbic pathway when we talk about drug addiction. So what comes first is normally the beginning of the pathway, and what comes latter is the end of the pathway. Okay, so if you think of this tract as a path from spinal cord to cortex. Okay, now let's look at this. So it's dorsolateral. You see on the bottom there, dorsolateral portion of the spinal cord. Okay, so dorsal is going to be on top, lateral is to the outside. You see where those interneurons are connecting is kind of to the outside of the spinal cord. So that's dorsolateral to the corticospinal tract. So cortico-cortex. Okay, so you know that that's going from dorsolateral portion of the spinal cord up to the cortex, and in this case, it's going to be your motor cortex because that's what we're dealing with. But you could even say to the cerebrum, right? The one on the right, again, it's dorsolateral portion of the spinal cord. Makes sense. It looks the same way there. The only difference here is that it's going up through red nucleus and then branches off. Okay. Now we have the ventromedial tracts. Okay. You also have a corticospinal here, control of proximal trunk and limb muscles. And then you have a cortico-brainstem spinal. And this interacts with various brainstem structures such as the tectum, the vestibular nucleus, reticular formation, and motor nuclei. Okay. It says here in your book that these different areas, I'll just give them to you since they're not on your slide there. The tectum, which receives auditory and visual information about spatial location, so that it passes through tectum there for the auditory and visual information. Then the vestibular nucleus, which receives information about balance from receptors in the semicircular canals. Remember, the vestibular sense was your sense of balance. Okay, the reticular formation contains motor programs that regulate complex species-typical movements such as walking, swimming, and jumping. Okay. And then the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves that control the muscles of the face. So those are all the functions of. I tried to give you the functions for each one of these areas. I think it makes that's kind of the primary purpose for you to retain this information. Okay, so now let's look at. You probably think to yourself, well, these are exactly the way that they looked before. Okay, they're similar but not exact. Let's start at the spinal cord level. Now look at this, ventromedial. Aha, ventral. That means it's below. So ventral towards the bottom, medial towards the middle. Okay, we were just looking at dorsolateral, top outside. Now we're looking at bottom inside. Ventromedial, then it goes up to the primary motor cortex, the corticospinal. Okay, so that's the corticospinal. The one to the right of it is the cortico-brainstem spinal. Same thing with the ventromedial portion at the bottom. The difference here is that now it's passing through the tectum, the reticular formation, motor nuclei, and the vestibular nucleus before it gets to the primary motor cortex. Okay, so those are your two divisions of the ventromedial, two divisions of the dorsolateral, and two of the dorso and two of the ventral. When comparing the two, this is a nice slide, kind of puts it in perspective for you. Even though we didn't go into a lot of these details, like the dorsolateral, one direct tract, one that synapses in the brainstem, terminates in one contralateral spinal segment, distal muscles, limb movements. Most important thing that I think it should be for you is that you know the directionality. So you know what dorsolateral, you know what ventromedial means, okay? And probably the last couple bullets. Distal muscles, limb movements for dorsolateral, for the ventromedial, proximal muscles, posture, and whole body movement. I think if you understand that, you'll be pretty good. Okay? And so now that we're down at the spinal cord level, now we're going to be leaving the spinal cord and innervating muscles. So motor circuits of the spinal cord show considerable complexity, independent of signals from the brain. And I just bring in this little caveat here for you because when we're talking about like reflexes occur outside of the central nervous system. Okay. So for the next 2 or 3 slides, we're just going to focus on basic anatomy. So let's just do basic anatomy for muscles real quick, and then we'll go back to how they're controlled by the cortical areas. So motor units. A motor neuron plus muscle fibers consists of a motor unit. All fibers contract when the motor neuron fires. Number of fibers per unit varies. Fine control, fewer fibers per neuron. Okay. For fine control, you're going to have fewer fibers per neuron. Muscle fibers bound together by a tendon. Just to let you know that a tendon connects muscle to muscle, whereas a ligament attaches muscle to bone. So we're dealing with tendons here. Acetylcholine released by motor neurons at the neuromuscular junction causes contraction. The motor pool are all motor neurons innervating the fibers of a single muscle. Fast muscle fibers fatigue quickly. Slow muscle fibers are capable of sustained contraction due to vascularization. So they have more supply, more blood supply there. They can last longer for slow muscle fibers. So like fast muscle fibers fatigue quickly. If you were to make bring up your arm and show your bicep muscle and squeeze really hard, you could do that for a little while, but then it would fatigue pretty quick. Those are fast muscle fibers. Slow muscle fibers would be all those fibers that would be involved with you standing upright, okay, or even sitting upright. You don't really think of fatigue factor unless it's been a really, really long time. Okay. So muscles are a mix of slow and fast fibers. Flexors bend or flex a joint, that makes sense, whereas extensors straighten or extend joints. Synergistic muscles are those muscles that act in parallel. They do the same thing. Antagonistic muscles are muscles that do opposite things. And an example here would be the bicep and tricep. When the bicep constricts, the tricep has to relax. When the tricep constricts, the bicep has to relax. Okay? And you could actually think of, this is what's so cool about anatomy, right? Is if you were looking at bicep, that means that you have 2 muscles that are moving, that are parallel to one another, and that's why it's bi-2 bicep. And then your tricep are 3 muscles that run parallel to one another, and that's why they're called triceps. The receptor organs of tendons are called the Golgi tendon organs. They're embedded in the tendons. Tendons connect muscle to bone, like I mentioned to you, and then they detect muscle tension, these Golgi tendons. All right. Now again, your book goes into vast detail about the different muscles and the afferent, efferent pathways here, and we're not going to go into that same detail. Okay. But I want you to know that a stretch reflex is monosynaptic. Okay, it serves to maintain limb stability. What that means is, and I don't think I have this one. If you look at figure 8.14, it's not on the slide, but you'll notice that there's a spindle afferent neuron there, and then a motor neuron. So you see how it's monosynaptic. There's only one synapse that's doing that. It also says the patellar tendon reflex is also a monosynaptic, and that one is shown to you. That's figure 8.13, okay, page 205. The withdrawal reflex is not monosynaptic, and the withdrawal reflex is done at the spinal cord level. So you notice how all of these are going into the spinal cord and right back out via these interneurons, okay, for these different reflexes. And it's fascinating there because remember how we just mentioned that you kick something, that pain is interpreted by the somatosensory cortex, then it's sent to the motor cortex back to your toe, pull your foot away, all that kind of interaction. Well, with a reflex, it goes to the spinal cord, and that's it. It's not hitting cortical regions. Okay, but with a reflex, withdrawal reflex, it's not monosynaptic. There's actually bundles of synapses, and it's nice in this way because it's pulling yourself away like the hot iron or whatever like that, and it's doing it to its maximum ability. Okay, if you only had one neuron, you would do it just in one way. Okay, but in this regard, you can move your limb away from that dangerous environment in multiple different ways because there's a lot of different synapses happen at one time. Okay, and now there's just a few general components that I want to go over before we're done with this chapter. It says perhaps all but the highest levels of the sensory motor system have patterns of activity programmed into them, and complex movements are produced by activating these programs. Cerebellum and basal ganglia then serve to coordinate the various programs. Okay, so that's good. Cerebellum and basal ganglia then serve to coordinate the various programs. Also, a given movement can be accomplished various ways using different muscles. Okay, now think about that. A given movement can be accomplished various ways. You'd think to yourself that we would only be able to lift our arms in one manner, like constricting the bicep and bringing it up. But think about the millions of different ways that we can move our hands and our fingers all around. Okay, and how that's possibly being wired together, how those neurons, having some neurons activate and some neurons not being activated, the whole deactivation, the whole depolarization, hyperpolarization thing, right? Some working as an agonist, some working as an antagonist. It completely blows your mind that we can move so fluidly and with all of these extensors and flexors and everything else going on. It's pretty crazy. The central sensory motor programs must be stored at a higher level than the muscle, and sensory motor programs may be stored in secondary motor cortex. Okay, and then the last thing that we have here is the electrotopic item, and I just have one item, but it's kind of extensive here, and I hope it's helpful actually to bring together all the concepts of this chapter. It says, provide me your best illustration of the analogy between the motor systems and business organizations. And I already did that for you, talked about the president and the vice president and so on. So you can use that same kind of a scenario. But I want you to provide all of the people involved, and in using a specific scenario, tell me how each individual handles the situation. So come up with a business decision, and then how that business decision flows from the president of the company to the clerk that is checking out an individual in a grocery store, let's say. Okay, and then in addition, using a specific scenario, tell me how each area of the motor system handles the information. And that would be also from association cortex all the way down to the muscles. Okay, so some kind of a movement. Does it involve visual information? So it has to pull from an association cortex to a secondary to a primary. Come up with a scenario for motor movement and then run through the entire process. Okay, so just one topic item, but it's 20 points, and you will be done with chapter 8. All right, I look forward to seeing you again or talking with you at least next week. Thank you.